Hello there, everyone. It's Tom Morgan from The Leading Edge, and today I am joined by The4thWay. Now, if you are not familiar with his genre, he is by far the most interesting and irreverent source of mystical memes on the internet, on both Twitter or X, and an amazing YouTube channel as well. The most mysterious thing about his account is the productivity and the array of resources that he brings to it. But I've also discovered that he is something of an expert on the topic of Gurdjieff. Now, Gurdjieff for me is a little bit like In-N-Out Burger. People with good taste seem to like it, but I've never really tried it. Over the last few weeks of digging into the genre of his work, it's clear that he's a bit of a trickster and deliberately sometimes quite hard to read. So I was really excited to talk to The4thWay about this today, as there seems to be a lot of depth in his work and a lot of really interesting and actually incredibly relevant stuff in his work. So firstly, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. Let's start with maybe a simple one. Who was Gurdjieff?
So Gurdjieff was someone who lived, he was born, and actually it's somewhat debatable exactly when he was born, somewhere between 1866 and 1877, I think. He was born in a little small Armenian village. I think his father was Armenian and his mother was Greek, or maybe it's the other way around. But essentially he was brought up in a very unusual circumstance to kind of the typical Western person. Where he was living was kind of like the backwater of Europe, and it was still very ancient. Kind of culturally, they still believed in a lot of fairy tales, and mythology was very big, especially to his father, who was like one of these type of bard, type people that had been passed down stories for generations, songs and stuff like that. And he was kind of the last in a long line of this very ancient line of kind of storytellers and musicians and things like that. So Gurdjieff kind of grew up learning all about music, all about mythology, and he kind of had the best education as well. Like his father was very had some very unusual ideas about how to raise a child and how to educate them and stuff like that. And he was sent to the best schools and, all that kind of stuff. And so he's grown up in this kind of very ancient kind of landscape. And then one day he runs across this this newspaper article that mentions the tablets of Gilgamesh, which were recently discovered. And he realized that one of the stories that he had been passed down from his father was, essentially this tale of Gilgamesh in another form. And this led him to kind of think about that and like what other types of ancient knowledge may be out there that we don't know about. So this kind of sent him on a quest to find different sources of ancient wisdom. He eventually met up with this kind of group of people that eventually called themselves the Seekers of Truth, and they were this group of people who are very interested in the mystery schools and kind of this ancient knowledge that had been passed down from generation to generation. And they would all go to these different mystery schools, and they would all come back together, and they would essentially synthesize. They would take the practices and metaphysics and different things from all the mystery schools, and they would bring them together. And he said that he learned more doing this than one person could pretty much do in an entire lifetime. And eventually he became very well known in kind of the esoteric circles and also scientific circles. He said that he could pretty much go to any expert in any field, whether it was science or kind of religion or mysticism, and essentially have access to the holy of holies of any kind of religious or scientific system that he wanted. And he was like compiling all of this knowledge. But the one thing that was kind of driving him crazy, he said it was kind of like a mania that he was driven to, and it started off in his youth and it kind of progressed into his adulthood. And it was kind of this question of what is the purpose of humanity in the greater kind of universal picture. Like, what is the purpose? What is our function? Especially for all life on Earth, but especially humans, and how are we meant to live? And he said that this question kept growing and growing in his brain, and despite all of his access to all of these experts and all of these secret religions and all of this kinds of stuff, no one could answer this question for him. The old texts couldn't answer it for him. These so-called experts couldn't answer it for him. So he was kind of driven a little bit mad by this idea of like, what is the function of life and humanity? And so he said what he eventually did about it was he meditated for several days or even weeks at this particular, I think it was like some type of monastery. I don't remember what kind. And he was like just meditating on it. What can I do to figure out the answer to this question? And eventually he had an idea. There was this, I believe it was a dervish monastery, where they studied this very particular kind of what he called ancient hypnotism, which they called Mechanis or Meheknis or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but it was essentially a super old, kind of, but very detailed and like precise kind of method of hypnosis. And he was like, I think for whatever reason, I'm not sure, but I think if I go and I study this more, I might be able to find the answer to this question. So he goes down to this Turkish or this dervish monastery, and he spends about 2 years, learning everything that he can about this particular brand of hypnosis. And he said by the time he was done, he basically had answered all of his questions, plus some stuff that he had never even thought to ask as well. Now, the question is, now he doesn't specifically elaborate on what that means. I have a few kind of harebrained theories as to what it could mean. What exactly did he find in this Turkish kind of monastery studying this type of stuff? So one of the more kind of woo theories that I have about this is that he essentially, I don't know, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dolores Cannon and her kind of work on like hypnotherapy, but then she kind of, she learned that by doing hypnotherapy, she eventually got in contact with what she called kind of like this quantum mind, or this, kind of these intelligences that were at the subconscious level that an ordinary consciousness couldn't reach. And it began to tell her, pretty much everything she wanted to know about the universe, how it worked, the laws of consciousness, the metaphysics, the aliens, life after death, past lives. She got all this information out of this stuff, supposedly. Now, whether you believe her or not is a different question, but she did train other people to do this, and they've said pretty similar things to her. So it could be that Gurdjieff, through this hypnotherapy technique, was able, like her, to kind of tap into this subconscious intelligence that just gave him all this information that he would later kind of codify in different ways. So that's kind of my woo theory. The less woo theory is just that he learned the very specific mechanisms of the subconscious and hypnotism, and through that was able to extrapolate pretty much all he needed to know about how what the purpose of life was, and all that kind of stuff, which we can get into the answer to that question later if you want. So he studies this hypnotism for about 2 years. It answers all his questions, and then he's like, okay, so I need to essentially do something with this. I need to do a bunch of experiments to try to see if I can actually change the course of kind of history of human psychology and development. How can I do this? Well, so his first step along the plan is he becomes a healer, and like a hypnotic healer. So he goes around and kind of heals people of various ailments through hypnosis, like if they want to stop smoking, if they want to eat less, a typical type of like stuff that you would do for like hypnotherapist or something like that. And he said that basically served two purposes. It helped those who needed help, but it also allowed him, essentially guinea pigs to experiment on in this kind of ancient science of hypnotism, so that he could kind of like, figure out the exact mechanisms of how the human subconscious operated. And so he does that for a few years, and there's even some speculation that he may have also, during this career, been some sort of spy or intelligence asset for the Russian monarchy, who, by the way, they were hiring people at that time like Rasputin and different people like that. So hiring someone like Gurdjieff, who was a hypnotherapist healer, I don't think would be too far out of what's possible. And there's some good evidence to back that up, that he was actually he was connected to them in some way, because the intelligence agencies had a big old dossier that they handed over to one of Gurdjieff's future students when he was kind of heading through Turkey, which is a whole another story. But anyway, so Gurdjieff, kind of starts as a healer, and then kind of moves into general spiritual teacher type of a role, where he starts in Russia, and he kind of like famously like burns all his paperwork, and then just like almost as if like he wanted to just like completely leave his past behind him and just like move into this new role as a teacher. And so he starts taking students sometime in like the early 1900s in Russia, where he eventually attracts someone like P.D. Ouspensky, who is a very at the time influential kind of scientist and spiritual philosopher and journalist that was connected to kind of the Russian and European intelligentsia, as well as like the Theosophy Society and different things like that. So when Ouspensky kind of gets behind Gurdjieff and starts like transmitting some of his teachings, it kind of gets Gurdjieff into the kind of the collective consciousness of Europe, and kind of a lot of the leading edge scientists and artists and different philosophers of the time, and he continued to kind of have a very sometimes volatile career, kind of teaching students and then dismissing the students because they weren't taking it seriously enough, or after his car accident, he kind of took a completely different approach, and started writing as opposed to directly teaching his students, and that's where he writes most of his books, kind of like in the second half of his career. So anyway, that's a long story. Hopefully I answered at least part of your questions. He's a very complex character, and a lot more could obviously be said about him, but that's kind of like my take on him.
It's an amazing summary. Thank you. You kindly recommended to me Layman Pascal's new book, Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds. and Pascal describes him as a cross between Borat, the Buddha, and Indiana Jones. And I was just like, that's an absolutely brilliant way with words. So what is the fourth way?
So the fourth way, according to Gurdjieff, and this is something that he kind of taught Ouspensky early in his teaching career, but then he kind of drops that vernacular kind of later on. But he kind of he's still saying the same things in a lot of ways. He's just putting it under different terminology a lot of times, and it's a very kind of strange part of the story. But anyway, the fourth way was this special mystery school teaching that differed from ordinary mystery school teachings, because, well, let me just start kind of at the big picture so you can understand how it developed. So what he said was actually part of the whole like Indiana Jones part of that equation is he traveled extensively throughout Egypt and various places in the Middle East and Asia and Europe, to all kinds of like hidden monasteries and spiritual places and stuff like that. And this was at a day and age where like you could just walk into the pyramids, like there was no and so he actually said during one of these adventures he had found a map of pre-sand Egypt. And, and through his investigations, essentially discovered that the origin of the mystery schools was basically this pre-sand Egypt civilization. And what they had done is they had set up these mystery schools in Egypt, and then they had set some up in like India and various places in the East, and then they had set some up in like the kind of like Eastern Europe type area. And they had set them up in one of three categories. I think he called them, one was philosophy, one was theory, and one was practice. And he didn't exactly define what those terms meant, but and later he kind of says that they were basically like centered around the main centers, mind, body, heart. Essentially they have these mystery schools divided into three categories, and you would go to a mystery school and you would kind of specialize in head, techniques or heart techniques or body techniques, etc. But the fourth way was kind of the special school that was for more kind of advanced type students that maybe had tried one of the other three ways, but for whatever reason couldn't make it all the way or couldn't make it work for some reason. And so the fourth way was kind of a synthesis of all of those three schools, meaning that they would teach you head, body, and heart exercises at once to kind of stimulate all of those centers and to kind of bring some type of cohesion that was more accelerated than your typical mystery school. So a lot of the things that he kind of teaches Ouspensky are based on this kind of this methodology of the fourth way, or kind of this idea of you should be not just working on one part of yourself at once, but you should really try to be working on all of yourself at the same time.
Yeah, and in Pascal's book, he talks about how an example would be going out, mowing the lawn, listening to a highly intellectual podcast, and giving thanks for how beautiful the day is, which, to be honest, to me sounds like, quite a lot of fun. Do you have a sense for like what kinds of activities would be like fourth way style activities in like the real world?
Yeah, so he used to have this exercise called the stop exercise, which is pretty interesting. It's where and he would do this with his students where he would just say stop. And then everyone who heard his voice had to stop whatever they were doing and maintain the exact position that they were in until he said you can release or whatever. And so like whatever you're doing, whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, try to keep feeling that, keep thinking that, keep doing that at the same time until I tell you you can stop. And that, essentially is, you have to concentrate mentally on what you were just thinking about. You have to feel what you're just feeling. You have to like in your body, be in your body. Like if you're like doing a handstand or something, you just gotta stay there. It's an effort made by more than just one part of you, and you essentially are forcing yourself to kind of cooperate because you really can't maintain it unless you're in a cooperative space.
I found an incredibly profound insight that dropped out of the Pascal book was essentially that this combination of head, body, and heart kind of trained you to deal with anomalies, a set of circumstances that you haven't seen before. And I'm like, look outside, guys. Like it's anomalies everywhere at the moment where the expert class is kind of failing. And no, it's this archetypally shamanic way of knowing. Like, does that resonate for you in terms of a skill set that we've kind of lost?
Yeah, for sure. It's I think Gurdjieff would kind of describe that as the loss of reason and the loss of intuition, because those were two big parts of his system. And reason is not he kind of changes the definition or expands the definition of what we normally think reason is, because you have thinking, which is mechanical, he described, essentially you have this the mental center, the thinking center, and then you have the higher intellectual center. And he said the problem is, not that there's anything wrong with the higher intellectual center. It's a problem with the lower center, where it's essentially lost its coherence and it's lost its connection to the higher center. So it can no longer hear the messages of the higher center, and it's strictly working on a very mechanical basis. So we've kind of lost our sense of direction because of that.
Yeah, because one of the other things that came out was, from our own explorations at Leading Edge, I would say one of the more effective therapeutic modalities that people have been pointing to is internal family systems, IFS. And when you read Gurdjieff and the work your work that I've been studying, it seems like he was quite early on the IFS train.
Yeah, his one of his big ideas is that man is not one person, but man is essentially legion. It's a symphony of parts. It's a symphony of kind of these lower selves that all kind of label themselves as you, but they're one takes over today, another one is in charge tomorrow, and they all kind of fight for control over kind of your identity and what actions you're taking and that type of thing. And so there's this system of different parts, and they're supposed to be blended together, but because they are all kind of dissociated from each other and kind of doing their own thing, they don't work as one unit, and so you get a lot of this infighting, and that leads to suffering and various other things. So yeah, he was very into both, trying to get people to realize that they have all of these different parts, and then trying to identify which parts go in which spot, and which parts, in a methodology of how to integrate them on kind of a step-by-step level in some cases. So there's an order and a pattern to these parts, and if you can bring your attention, if you can bring your awareness to these particular parts, especially through self-observation and what he called self-remembering, you can essentially create a fusion of these elements, and they essentially team up, and they will kind of work together to accomplish the goal. There's actually a really good analogy that he gives, and I think it's very similar to kind of the master and his emissary. The actual analogy that McGilchrist used for his book, where he says that essentially an organism is like it's like some type of hotel with a lot of different or like some type of like royal house in England or something that has a lot of servants, right? And there's you have all these servants, and then you have like a steward that is supposed to be in charge of the students. But the problem with this particular house is that all of the servants are kind of not working really well. They're kind of a few of them are lazy, some of them are stealing things, some of them are picking fights with the guests, some of them are eating all the food, so it's a rowdy bunch of employees. And the steward is kind of also lazy and not really paying attention to what's going on. So what has to happen is the steward has to essentially take all of these employees one by one, and observe what they're doing, talk to them, understand why are they being lazy, why are they why are they stealing, etc. Reform the particular servants involved. And then once the house is in reasonable order and the servants are doing the jobs that they were actually designed to do, that's when the master of the house can come back and start giving orders to the deputy steward, and the house will actually be able to do the things that the master needs it to do. And so it's this kind of this symphony of parts that are, kind of in disarray, but you're gradually bringing them into cohesion. And then once you're more cohesive, then you actually have the ability to kind of do higher things than just, infighting and surviving and all that kind of stuff.
So talking about higher things, we can't keep people in suspense for any longer. What do you think Gurdjieff thought the meaning of life was?
So he was actually asked this question, I think, in Search of the Miraculous, which is a really great book, one of my favorite ones about Gurdjieff. And he says, there's not one meaning of life, there's many. But I think if I could boil it down to kind of the most essential part of the meaning of life, you have to really zoom out super, super big picture to look at not just what the meaning of our life is, but what is the kind of the meaning of life in the cosmos and, the galaxy and, the biosphere and all these other kinds of things, because he links all of these up. And essentially what he says is going on is there's this, essentially this thermodynamic process going on where he calls it a system of mutual feeding. And so there's this energy transmutation that's going on where the energy from the high level, it comes down and then it has to go back up. And then it goes down and it comes back up. But each time it's kind of transmuting itself into higher higher densities or higher, more refined energies, I think as Gurdjieff would probably say. And so all of, kind of the cosmos is participating in this thermodynamic exchange of energies. And actually it's pretty interesting if you look at different modern scientific thinkers like I think it was I'm not sure if it was Heisenberg. It may have been Heisenberg, or it may have been one of the other early quantum scientists. Originally coined the term thermodynamic God, because he noticed that, the second law of thermodynamics is everything deteriorates, right? But he noticed that, with life doesn't deteriorate. It is because it's a closed system that's transmuting that energy, and it grows in complexity instead of falling apart. So he essentially called that process the thermodynamic God. And Gurdjieff, I think, kind of has a similar view of God, kind of playing this thermodynamic role where the energy is being transformed from like this lower base energy into these higher refined substances. And so the kind of the way that life on Earth functions is the energy starts at it starts going from the sun, beaming down to the plants, which, photosynthesis create a certain type of energy. That energy goes to the animals. That creates, a higher level of energy. And then humans are kind of that next level of energy. He said that they're on some type of organic planet, there has to be a dominant sapient species, and their job is to kind of take this energy from the lower plant and animal level and to transmute it into an even higher energy for the rest of the cosmos. And that energy that we transmute will be, continue to go upward and will be refined by the planets and the galaxies and, the different, things in the solar system. And it will just, it'll keep going up, and then the energy will keep going down. So it's the system, and we're essentially like a bridge between different energies and trying to refine it up to a higher level. And he said the problem with this is that we've become essentially very bad at transmuting energy. And there's only two ways the universe can get energy. It can either this particular energy that it needs from us. it can either get it through our deaths, which releases a small amount of energy, but it does release some of this energy that the universe needs, or it can get it through consciously assimilating it, which means that it requires enough people on Earth to be sufficiently conscious in order to create a higher level of this kind of cosmic energy that can be transmuted. And he said that's one of the problems why we've run into so many wars and famines and death, all this kinds of stuff, is because we're so messed up as a society. Society is so warped our minds to be, essentially hypnotically, in a hypnotic trance, so that we're making kind of these bad decisions. It has to get it through death, but it could get it another way. It could get it if we became more conscious and were able to consciously assimilate this energy. And so, essentially so he kind of reframes in some way, like the spiritual journey is not just this selfish thing that I'm doing for my own benefit, although I will benefit from it, but it's actually it's good for the environment, it's good for the universe, it's good for everyone for you to become more conscious, because you can essentially be a better conduit for this this transmutation of energy that's happening everywhere.
It's absolutely wild hearing that, because on this channel alone we've had a gentleman called Ulysses de Corpo, we've had Erwin Laszlo, and de Corpo talks about syntropy, which is this symmetrical force to entropy, and Erwin Laszlo talks about the holotropic attractor. We've had people come and talk about complexity theory, and the idea being exactly that this is countervailing force to entropy, that is, you follow, in my layman's parlance, you follow just by pursuing anything that gives you energy. And there are higher forms of energy than others, and essentially it's doing what you love in service of love, something that's differentiated and integrated, which also drops into complexity theory as well. And I'm guessing that then links back to this idea of when you're this kind of awake, unified whole, you can put all of your parts together chasing some sort of higher good. Is that how it all links together?
Yeah, so his idea was that you had to, by kind of creating this cohesion of internal systems, you essentially tap into what he called will, which is the ability to do. He said that that's really one of the key illusions that people have, is that they think that they have the ability to do, but everything actually just happens. So like it happens because and for success or fail, like it really doesn't matter. Like you could be a king or you could be a beggar, but the same rules apply. You just happen to luck into being a king, or you just happen to luck out and become a beggar. But either way, you didn't really have any part in that, because your subconscious is actually ruling the show, not the conscious part that our ego kind of wants to take credit for. And so by basically being able to correlate all of these different separate pieces to yourself, you get them on the same team, then you actually have the ability to do something out of your own will versus something just happening by chance.
Now, you're something of a mystic in your own right. And when we talked the first time, you said you thought there were some aspects of your learning that would enhance what Gurdjieff found. Is that something you'd like to talk about?
Yeah. So there's a lot of, I think, kind of modern ideas that really sink in well with the Gurdjieff teachings. Gosh, there's so many of them. Where do I start? Well, one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is if you connect the left hemisphere, right hemisphere ideas of McGilchrist with this idea that Gurdjieff had between essence and personality, and it also relates pretty strongly to what he would call reason versus intuition. And so I'll talk about both of those, but essentially what he called essence versus personality is, I think, there's a lot of correlations between left hemisphere, right hemisphere. Personality is what you learn, it's essentially the knowledge and the experience that your left hemisphere, what he would call the kind of lower intellectual center. This is where you accumulate all of your knowledge and experiences, and it forms a sort of personality that has automatic reactions to things. And then you have your essence, which is very much more right hemispheric. It's your essence are the functions of your machine. So like your senses and your your kind of your basic, like how you perceive emotions, not the actual content or kind of the intellectual side of your emotions, but like the actual function of feeling or the actual function of sexuality, those types of things. Those are your basic functions. And then on top of that, you have personality, which is all the stuff that learns. So you have a very, more right hemisphere, kind of the basic, like kind of the data coming into your functions, and then you have kind of the mental representation of those functions, which is in the personality. And to Gurdjieff's mind, I think where he differs from a lot of other spiritual paths is, I think that a lot of spiritual, especially Eastern spiritual type of practices and stuff like that, they really try to get you in a very right hemisphere mode, which is, kind of seeing things in the present moment, kind of being aware, being, more in touch, seeing things more clearly, that type of thing. But a lot of times they leave out, what do you do with it actually after, you've had those experiences, and how do you translate those experiences back so that it reshapes, your mental processes. And that's what Gurdjieff was all about, kind of this balance between essence and personality. And so he thought that, you essentially have to, in the personality, you have what he called the formatory apparatus, which is essentially, I almost think of it, I don't know if you've read Thinking Fast and Slow. Yeah. But this kind of formatory apparatus has a very similar feel to kind of how System 2 works, where it's like, it's where all the cognitive biases are. It's where it's designed to save you energy, right? Because the cognitive center can't put in work on all of your decisions all at once. So it's designed, this System 2 is kind of a shortcut of like, here's what's worked before, let's save you time and energy by just making it automatic. The problem with that is a lot of those things in your formatory apparatus are either just straight up lies, or they're, illusions, or they're rumors, or they're, things that you've misperceived in some way. And so it's all kinds of full of these contradictions and errors of thought, and full of what he called buffers, which is, essentially, like, let's say that like someone cut you off in traffic, right? And your first urge just kind of like, give the guy the finger and just say, F you. That's, essentially kind of like a buffer at work, where it's like, instead of taking your responsibility for what you did, you're blaming it on someone else. And so that it's preventing you from looking within and actually understanding the root cause of what's going on, because you think that you already know what's going on. It's the other person's fault. And actually this, when Gurdjieff was studying, like I mentioned, that ancient Turkish discipline of hypnosis, they called it mekenes or something, which basically translates to the taking away of responsibility. And so, and that's very much a left hemispheric kind of mode of operation, where you're, blaming something else for what happens, instead of, trying to openly perceive what actually is the case. So the first step of Gurdjieff's ideas is to take what he calls thinking. Thinking is the lower part of your intellectual center, and it's the mechanical part. So it's all mechanical. It just kind of works, and you can stuff up. It's kind of like an AI. You can just stuff information into it, and it will rattle off an answer, right? It doesn't really understand what it's talking about, but it has all this information, and you ask it a question and it can rattle it off. It's very efficient, right? But the problem with it, again, is that it's very mechanical. It's not conscious. So what do you do in that case? You have to bring in something that's called reason, and reason is a different degree than thinking. Reason is something that true reason, what he calls objective reason, and there's a lot of gradations of reason, so it's not all one thing, but it's simpler if you just kind of divide it in these categories to initially understand it. So objective reason is something that requires impartiality. And how do you get impartiality? Well, you have to develop a conscience. What is a conscience? In Ouspensky's terms, a conscience is when you feel all of your feelings at once. You're essentially connected to not just the emotional center, but the emotional center in combination with the moving center and the instinctual center, which, we can get into the minutia of that if you want, but that's just to save time. So once you have the emotional center, the instinctive center, and the moving center lined up, then reason, when it's impartial, when you can clear it out of all these misconceptions and biases and kind of bad mechanical thinking habits from the mechanical thinking center, when you can combine those, that can become reason. So it's essentially a form of thinking that can check itself. And again, I think this is very similar to the left hemisphere, right hemisphere kind of thing, where the right hemisphere is open, it views what is, it's connected to both your internal and external systems, whereas the left hemisphere kind of processes that information and kind of is the servant of the emotional side. So in his mind, what you have to do is you have to build on this in a step-by-step way, where, because if one side gets too far ahead of the other, you run into problems. So if essence gets too far advanced, then you end up he used to say waking up to an empty room, which I think can be somewhat similar to like a Buddhist that has gotten so enlightened or whatever that they've like completely lost touch with their personality and their daily life. They're just kind of in a blissed out state, but nothing really matters to them, right? On the other hand, if the personality, and it's very rare to get that type of person these days, because our personality has such a stranglehold over society and most individuals, that I think a lot of people run to that kind of Buddhist methodology because they need an escape from the personality and the mind, and I think that's a good step. But if you stop there, that can be a problem. But it is a good step in the right direction based on what where society is right now. So what you have to do is taken into step-by-step basis where they both kind of advance each other, and they're both kind of bouncing. One is checking the other. The conscience is checking the reason, and the reason is checking the conscience, and they're all kind of working in this symphony. And so again, there's different gradations of reason, but if you can kind of advance your thinking, as well as kind of your more right hemispheric and emotional and bodily functions into this very particular kind of set where it's you're combining thinking with a conscience and a kind of what did I call it earlier, a kind of a neutral view, or a where it's non-biased. You can essentially make yourself bring your consciousness to the level of objective reason, which is kind of the highest level of consciousness for a human, where you can kind of both understand everything that's kind of happening within your own organism, as well as everything that's kind of happening in the outside world as well. And it's not necessarily that you have like access to all the information in the world, kind of like a computer or anything, but like if you can essentially more likely like see behind the curtain of circumstances and make better judgments, and those types of things.
I mean, it sounds very much to me like the definition of wisdom I most like, which is basically just knowing what to do and when. And when you look at, when you unpack wisdom, wisdom also seems to be related to balanced hemisphere function, where the right is leading the left, but you still have a great interplay between them. And for me, it's absolutely electrifying hearing you talk across all of these topics, because as listeners will know, I think McGilchrist's hemisphere theory is one of the most robust explanatory models of the world that I've ever encountered. So you have this guy running through all these different theses that then are subsequently being endorsed by some of the greatest thinkers of our time.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's a ton of other parallels as well to other different types of scientific studies. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with Michael Levin and his whole idea of like bioelectric networks and stuff like that?
I have lost count of the number of people that have sent me Levin's links and told me to dig into him, but I'm not familiar with his work at all.
Okay, so his work is fascinating, and I think it does bear a resemblance to a lot of the things that Gurdjieff would talk about, because he's been studying essentially evolutionary biology, and what he's discovered is that there are these essentially bioelectric energy, grids or systems or whatever you want to call them between the different cells in kind of at the microscopic level. And at a very broad picture, he's done like experiments with cancer, for example. This is one of the big things that he's known for, is he's done studies of like you inject mice with these cancer cells, right? And then those cancer cells will multiply and stuff like that. And what he's discovered using these electrical networks is that if you can read the code of these electrical networks, then you're essentially reading the mind of how these cells are communicating and working together to solve particular problems. And he says that in cancer in particular, you have this phenomenon where if the cancer cell is part of this, if it gets co-opted into this electrical network, it stops being cancerous. But if it's outside of the electrical network, then it keeps being cancerous. And so his idea is that essentially, we may have medicine completely wrong. We may have been trying to do medicine at a molecular level, and that's kind of like working on the hardware. But he said, really, what we should be thinking about is how do we modify the software? Because once we change the software of the cells, and once we get them communicating with this, kind of higher mind bioelectrical grid, you can essentially turn the cancer back into a normal cell. And it turns out that he actually uses the term dissociated. These cells, once they leave the network, essentially become dissociated, and they block the connection to this network. And he said these networks can solve very advanced problems, and they have no idea. It kind of throws the whole theory of evolution, the way we've seen it, out of the water, because he said that these cells, he'll put these cells, like he was doing this experiment with tapeworms, and he put them in a solution of barium, which is something that it's very rare, and it's something that these tapeworms would have never seen before. So they would have absolutely zero evolutionary data in their genes as to how to solve this problem. And he said, yet within like a period of 10 days, despite this barium made their heads explode, by the way, and they don't die because they can regenerate the head. But he said, basically about 10 days later, they regrew the head, and the barium's like blocking the potassium, so they can't make the head. So the cells had to figure out another way to make the head, and they did. And they have absolutely no genetic memory of how to do this. They just figured it out. And so his idea is that these energy grids possess kind of like this collective intelligence that can actually solve problems that the individual cells can't fix by themselves, but the combined kind of intelligence of these grids working together actually can solve super complex problems. And so I think that's in a lot of ways kind of how the Gurdjieff system is working. I think that these types of kind of bioelectric energy grids are at pretty much all levels of kind of the universe, kind of like morphic fields, and they contain this information, and they're coordinating the memory and the actions and the different things like that. The question is, are you able to tune into this energy or not? Are you dissociating from it, or are you not? And it's like they've done these studies, like people who actually have dissociative identity disorder, where, like, there was this one person, I think a few years ago in Germany. She had suffered some type of car accident, and she had developed like multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, or whatever they're calling it now. The crazy thing is that when she was in a certain personality, she was blind, but when she was in other personalities, she wasn't blind. And they took her to the doctor and did these brainwave studies, and sure enough, like, there's no way you can fake the actual brain patterns. When she was in this particular blind personality, it literally, there was no eye sensory data in the brainwaves. But when she was in her other personality, there was full brainwave kind of activity in the brain. So what this says to me is that different parts of your organism can dissociate, much like these cancer cells dissociate and they become cancer. I think that other parts, other organs, different parts of your identity, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, all these things are capable of essentially, kind of dissociating and blocking itself from this, these kind of informational energy grids that are all around us. And so you can get these patterns of, kind of dissociated clumps of, your personality that kind of do different things and are not aligned. But if you can kind of break down those barriers and force a cohesion into these networks, then you're tapping into what Gurdjieff called will, which is kind of this higher level ability to kind of not just do your own will, but kind of do the will of the universe through you, something like that.
That's incredible, because I mean, one way of looking at the left hemisphere, when people have, left hemisphere lock, or they're, really stuck into abstractions, they're essentially dissociated, right? They're so blocked from the world, they can't connect to, what I've called attractor intelligence, but it is this syntropic, holotropic force that, again, in the Levin framing, is basically just bringing you to an energetic frequency where you can be guided. And I actually saw a Levin clip earlier this week that someone sent me, where he was talking about synchronicity, that effectively, like, one of these dynamics is that the lower can't see the higher, that, like, you have a rough idea probably of what it's like to be your dog, but your dog has no idea what it's like to be you. And if we did exist in a system that was way more intelligent than us, we probably wouldn't be able to conceptualize it. And so Levin was like, the way that the higher intelligence would signal back down to us that we were doing the right thing might be like synchronicity. So it's sort of like you get guided by this higher intelligence in ways that give you like little meaningful nudges. But as you reconcile your parts, to your point, you bring in the little bits of you that are like dissociated and draining your energy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so he was actually very big on, it's funny you mentioned energy, because he was very big on like creating different systems to help you maximize your energy systems internally, because he had this theory about energy accumulators. Essentially the way the energy accumulator works is that like each center kind of has their own energy accumulator. So let's take like your mind, for example. Like so you're sitting down and you're trying to write a book, or you're trying to write an article or something, right, like that, right? And then you get tired. you're mental, you're mentally exhausted, you can't write anymore, blah blah blah. Or let's say that your body, for example, let's say you're going for a run, and you're running for a while, and then you start to get tired. Gurdjieff would say, push through that,
Hmm.
because what happens is, you have these small energy accumulators, one for your mind, one for your body, etc. But they have these little, there's a diagram of it, but it's like this little accumulator, and then kind of a pipe, and then it has like a little circuit breaker on it right here. And so like that little circuit breaker is usually what tells you I'm tired, or I'm mentally exhausted, I can't go on anymore. But he said if you can break through that initial resistance, and push through to the other side, you can access the great accumulator that has almost nearly unlimited energy. But most of us don't ever see it or get to it, because we give up after our mind says are tired, our body says are tired, and we're just like, okay, well, I guess I'm tired, I'm gonna just stop now. But he said if you can actually push through that initial kind of impulse, and try to constantly do more than you think you can, you'll find that you'll gain greater and greater abilities to both accumulate and use your energy in different ways. And there's a really interesting scientific study they did about, I don't know if you've seen this study that they did with the drowning rats, but yeah, so they took these rats, and initially, if you just throw the rat in the water, it drowns within like 5 minutes or something. But if you take a rat and you almost drown it, but then you save it, and then you throw it in the water again, it can last 24 hours or a couple of days of just swimming, whereas the average rat lasts 5 minutes. So this idea that the idea is that this kind of this glimmer of hope that the rat was given essentially enabled it to get past its initial kind of idea of like it's tired, and it would just like keep going, keep going, keep going, and it had access to a greater store of energy. So that was one of Gurdjieff's techniques, is to kind of have his students like dig ditches all day and then fill them back in, and then like try to get them purposefully exhausted so that they would eventually develop the willpower to kind of overcome their initial barriers and be able to tap into like a greater energy field.
Well, there's also the idea that I've obviously been historically quite wary of the idea of like frequency or vibration. But then the more you go into like the empirical science, and we had Julia Mossbridge on recently of like unconditional love, it's clear that something very different happens when you're in a state of unconditional love. In her research, she finds that people become more precognitive, which is surprisingly well scientifically validated. But there's this idea, I think, that once we, quote unquote, raise our vibration by pursuing, what we love in service of what we love, we gain access to that store of energy where perhaps it actually feels less effortful, right? Like we can do more with less.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that yeah, that type of like digging ditches and that kind of thing, it's obviously not the ideal way to go about it, but I think that if you're tapped into kind of this higher level of will energy, it does kind of have this self-feeding process where it feels like you are getting more energy than you're putting into it. But it does take a lot of kind of discipline and kind of just a lot of a lot of effort to get into that space sometimes.
Are there any other puzzle pieces or resonances that you've noticed with Gurdjieff's work and what's coming out currently?
Yeah, so there's another. Are you familiar with Donald Hoffman and his ideas? I think that's another pretty resonant space right now, because and Donald Hoffman, he started as kind of I think a neuroscientist, and now he's doing a lot more like general physics and pure math type stuff at the moment. But in his neuroscience studies, he discovered that, not only are the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, like if you separate the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, you can see they have their own distinct personalities. But when you put them together, they kind of form into one personality, right? But he said that you can divide the left hemisphere, and if you do that, they'll be their own separate personalities. But he said you don't have to stop there. You can keep dividing them, and 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 you can do this pretty much, ad infinitum, all the way, down to, maybe the cellular level, if not beyond. And he said that the mathematical, he's developed this whole like mathematical framework as to how these agents interact with each other. And in fact, his kind of newer theory about this, he's kind of taken the neuroscience of this from from an individual brain level, and now he's trying to apply it to the entire universe. So his kind of ideas is essentially almost like a the Joule Indra's net type of, kind of, at least that's the way I picture it, where you have all of these agents that are kind of subdivided, and pretty much the entire universe could be just conscious agents all the way down. Like, everything is essentially made up of these agents interacting, and that's how we see reality. But he said one of the interesting experiments that he's done with kind of this agent framework is he has this idea that reality is essentially almost like a virtual reality headset is kind of the analogy that he uses. And he said it's not necessarily that reality is all illusory. There is something real behind the VR headset, but we're only getting kind of like there's something real within a computer, but you're not necessarily at the code level when you're operating the computer. You're operating it via, a desktop where you have icons and you have different things like that to click on. It simplifies all that code so that you can actually use the computer in a usable way, right? And he said reality is something like this, where our senses and the things that we experience aren't necessarily real. They're more like icons on a desktop that kind of give us a simulated, simpler version of reality that we can actually work with. And he said he's done these experiments with these agents, and he's to see how they evolve over time. And so he'll have these different agents compete with one another. And on one side, you have agents that are they have zero idea about the ultimate nature of the reality that they're in, but they are super geared towards having a good UI that's fit for survival. And then on the other side, you have agents that they know everything that's going on behind the scenes. They have a full degree of truth, but their UI is not set up for simplicity. And he said you can see how these agents evolve over time, and the ones that the ones that have a simplified UI that's geared towards survival, it's not even close. They beat the people who see truth every time. And so essentially what he's saying, and how I think that this relates to Gurdjieff, I think that we've essentially evolved with a UI that's been geared towards survival, and it's worked really well for kind of that survival function. However, because we've become what Gurdjieff would say hypnotized to kind of the user interface, we no longer have that truth to kind of balance us out. And so we've become super focused on survival, super focused on kind of getting what's ours, but we don't have kind of the depth to understand that this is just the UI. This is not actually the truth of what's happening. And I think that his whole methodology is to kind of give you a better UI that is more harmonized with truth, so that it actually not only just works better than the original UI that we have, but it's actually more synthesized with truth, so that it's more harmonic with not just our own life or our family's life, but also the biosphere, the planet, the solar system, all this stuff. It has multiple benefits on multiple layers. If you can change, it's all about, I think, like metacognition and understanding your thoughts, understanding the way it works, so that you can form it in a way that is more. It's still a UI. It's still kind of operating within a simplified function, but the functions are more in tune with what is actually going on, within yourself and the universe, than are the one that we've been handed down through culture and society and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, my takeaway from Hoffman was very, very similar. And I remember I read his work around about the same time as I read this essay about the Umwelt, which was this concept of like, it's very easy for us to understand how another species would have like a worse sensory experience of the world. Like an earthworm has never seen a sunset, will never see a sunset, and couldn't even conceptualize what a sunset is. But it's very, very hard for us to understand that another species could have a dramatically richer experience, either in a smell or a sight or a sound spectrum. But when you look at, like, we think our sight is probably our most evolved sense, but when you look at the percentage of the electromagnetic spectrum that we see, it's something like a 10 trillionth of it. So like even just arithmetically, we see and experience a microscopic sliver of the world. And for me, I was like, okay, cool, what do you do with that information? For me, it was this idea like yours, that if that's true, there could be forces acting on us from outside of our desktop that maybe are a direction of truth, that is this holotropic attractor, that is this energetic frequency, that when you tune to that truth, you do get guided in a more beneficial direction. And I suppose what's dropping for me right now is that if you're optimized for survival, that's kind of this very left hemispheric way of thinking, where it's also probably very, very difficult, like, because you've been just so optimized for this way of cognition. Whenever you try and present people with the alternative viewpoint, they snap back really, really hard into kind of consensus reality, probably for quite good reasons. But if you do that, you're not going to get access to this force from outside of the desktop that's probably guiding you in a very beneficial direction.
Yeah, totally.
Was there anything else in terms of additional pieces that you felt were adding to the puzzle?
So I definitely think that the Enneagram is also a good, and this is a little less scientific, more spiritual, but I do think that the Enneagram is gaining traction some in psychology in general. But yeah, I think that it's actually an interesting story about the Enneagram, because I had just learned about it right before kind of getting into Gurdjieff. I'd kind of done the whole like take the personality tests and like analyze my friends and family with it, and all that kind of stuff. And so it's actually funny, because Gurdjieff actually introduces the modern version of the Enneagram for the first time in like the early 1900s. Now, he didn't actually do the way he was using it was different. He wasn't using it as a personality tool. And some people in the Fourth Way really don't like the Enneagram personality system, because they think it's kind of a perversion of what Gurdjieff was talking about. I think it's a perfect fit into his system myself. And I think that it really maps out, like I was telling you, the difference between personality and essence. It really maps out the personality side very well, but not just the personality, but it has different levels of health. And the way I interpret that is how integrated the personality is with your essence. And so, and Gurdjieff talks a lot about things like the chief feature and which is supposedly the aspect of your personality which everything revolves around. And things like there was like a man number one, man number two, man number three. Man number one is a man of the mind. Man number two is a man of the emotions. Man number three is a man of the body. And that's kind of like, not that everyone doesn't contain all three to some extent, but you tend to lean towards one of those kind of sides in your personality. Well, the Enneagram is set up pretty much just like that, where I mean, there's 9 total types, but they're divided into threes, and you have a head type, you have a body type, you have a 3 emotional types, and they all interact in certain ways, and I think it's a very good elaboration and kind of more accurate pinpointing of the personality than Gurdjieff gave in his original teaching. So I think it's a wonderful tool to kind of use, if you're gonna, if you're gonna do any kind of spiritual work, but especially, kind of fourth way type of spiritual work, the Enneagram is a great tool that can help you do that. And there's a really interesting, actually, analysis of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, which I'd like to tell you about just real quick. Because I kind of picked up on this when I first read In Search of the Miraculous. It was kind of right after I kind of learned the Enneagram stuff, and I almost immediately after reading it for the first time pinpointed Gurdjieff as a type 8 and Ouspensky as a type 5. And the two are a very interesting combination. Like, I'm a 5, myself, and so I definitely very much identified a bit with Ouspensky's kind of whole way of thinking and mindset and that kind of thing. Whereas Gurdjieff is a type 8, which is actually the growth point for a 5. So like a 5, if he is growing and integrating, will look similar to an 8 because that's kind of their growth pattern. So for me, it was kind of like the perfect, like, I'm a 5, I'm trying to grow into an 8. This is Ouspensky when he met Gurdjieff, kind of learning from an 8. So it was kind of a great, not just spiritual, kind of rabbit hole to dive down, but it also like applied directly to my own, kind of development. But one of the interesting things about a 5 and an 8, the Enneagram has this thing called a holy idea, which is essentially what your personality is striving to accomplish, but it's usually fucks it up in some way. Like, for example, the holy idea for the 5 is something called holy omniscience, which is this idea that you can essentially know everything. Like, you can see and understand anything that you want, like the holy omniscience. That's kind of the idea of what the 5 is going for. However, the downside to that is that if they're not properly integrated, they can just stay in this observer mode and this like information, feeding mode, where it's just a hoarding of information, and you're always looking for more information, and you never actually do anything with the information. You're just kind of sitting there getting as much information as you can because you may need it one day or something like that. But the idea of a good 5, that is actually able to integrate themselves is someone that can actually do something with the information. That they can write a book, they can write a blog, or do stuff like that. And that's kind of was one of my main impetuses for kind of getting on social media and making YouTube videos and stuff like that. It's like, I've been learning all this information, and actually have to like put something out there to do something with it. But a type 8's holy idea is the idea of holy truth. And so you have so the key question is, what's the difference between truth and omniscience? So omniscience is kind of this idea that you can know everything, but truth actually lives it out. Truth is actually, the embodiment of this knowledge. And so Gurdjieff is a type 8. The shadow side of the holy truth is kind of like a bully who like just pushes everyone around and trying to embody the truth, but they're so like bull in a china shop about it that they just kind of like turn into a bully. But a high level, kind of someone who's actually integrated with their holy truth is someone who has integrated, and they may be still a little pushy. And Gurdjieff was very pushy sometimes, and he could be very, very much an 8. An 8 is called the achieve, or sometimes they're called the protector. What are they called? The defender, something like that. Anyway, but they're very they're action oriented people. They go and get stuff done. They're very much Winston Churchill type people. They can be very magnetic, and but they're always like someone like Donald Trump is also an 8, but they're kind of like the unhealthy version of the bull in the china shop type thing. So yeah, but a healthy 8, they have this kind of magnetic, get it done type of energy, and and so I think to some extent that explains a good deal of Gurdjieff's kind of bizarre things that he would do, and the way that he would kind of sometimes be a bit abrasive or pushy with his students in certain ways, because he would allow his personality. He was always telling his students, you have to allow a little bit of egotism in. You don't want to get rid of all of it, but you have to integrate it. But you need to at least save some of your kind of energy for your own personal pursuits, and allowing your kind of personality to do what it's good at. And so he was always very he was always kind of utilizing his personality, but then you could also tell through a lot of his books he was very he would very often kind of make fun of himself and his personality as well. So he was like very much almost a caricature of himself, and he understood that, and he was kind of like willfully playing this role, even though he didn't necessarily have to play the role, but he felt it was kind of his duty to kind of play this role.
So if I'm hearing it correctly, the resonance of the Enneagram is also that it can give you a pointer as to what you would look like if all your parts were integrated.
Right, exactly. Yes.
What you should be striving towards.
Yes, totally.
That's amazing. All right. The Fourth Way. I have taken a lot of your time. This has been like absolutely stunning to hear how many different areas of leading edge philosophy and science Gurdjieff actually resonated with, which is always incredible. I love following patterns and seeing how they all mesh together, and it's wild that someone who you put so much faith in seems to have really been genuinely ahead of his time.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I don't know how I kind of lucked into getting into this this kind of idea space, but yeah, it's been very fruitful for sure.
So where can people find you in your work?
Yeah, so mainly Twitter and YouTube. I do have a smattering of smaller accounts on some other platforms, but that's kind of my main 2 channels.
And they're both strongly recommended. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.